Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our first session on the last day of ETS 2021. I'm Joyce, Deuley, Senior Research Analyst, and I am joined by some pretty phenomenal individuals today. We've got Dr. Shuli Goodman, Executive Director at LF Energy. We have John Miri, CAO at LCRA. Whew, that's a lot of letters. Dominic, Brennan, Senior Specialist at SAP Utilities. Welcome, everybody. So good to have you today.
Hey,
Thank
Joyce.
you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to be talking about natural disasters, cyber threats, how they're becoming more frequent, and what the combined things that they're doing to the aging infrastructure we're seeing in real time. Modernizing and maintaining this grid is really difficult, y'all. So let's just go ahead and start diving into the questions. And this question, I think, is going to really set the tone for what we're going to be talking about today. And that is, what if the grid of the future isn't a grid at all? And what would it look like? Shuli.
This is one of my favorite questions because, as power system engineers, I think a lot of us kind of get caught in assuming that the past is going to look a lot like the future. From my perspective, where I sit in Northern California, I look out the window and I see trees. And so I think a lot about biomimicry. And if I had to make a guess about what the grid of the future is going to look like, it is going to be more like a forest. It's going to be more like hyphae, where you actually have a web, and that energy is distributed in a way to support the whole of society, and not just benefit a few. So kind of more like a network, more like the internet, very complex and from the bottom up.
Fabulous. Thank you. Dominic.
Yeah, I'll echo Shuli's point there. I believe that it's going to transform, evolve, morph into an internet of electric grid, and allow plug and play, allow two-way generational transmission, and be much more dynamic in the future, and be responsive to the needs. Today's grid is very structured, very resilient in many ways, but the change that's happening and the transformation and the empowerment of end customers and industry in providing their own power, storing their own power, governing their electric consumption needs to be embraced by the grid much more rapidly than today's infrastructure and grid setup allows. So the internet of the grid is my view of the future, possibly.
Fabulous. Thank you. And John, what's your vision for the future of the grid?
So I agree as well. For me, I mean, I'm in my 8th year at LCRA, which is a power and water utility in Central Texas. But the first 2/3 of my career were in internet software companies, and I feel like the energy network, such as we call it a grid, probably going back to when Thomas Edison laid a bunch of wires down the streets of Manhattan, which are laid out in a grid. I'm not sure it even really looks like a grid now in terms of, straight lines and 90-degree angles that it had in those really early days. But to me, I think that the challenge of resilience leads to an energy network, a power grid of the future that is more like the internet. And as Shuli said, more organic almost, that can handle threats and can move power in two directions and can adapt and self-heal to new threats that hit it from a variety of different angles. And I think that looks a lot more, as Dominic said, a lot more like the internet than it does the traditional central station power model that we've come to accept in this industry.
Thank you all so much. I mean, I think it's really fascinating to think of, utilizing biomimicry or, putting natural systems in place when we're talking about how things communicate and connect with each other. And things are going to only get more complex, which, more complex and more distributed. So thank you for your visions. Just a reminder to the audience, if you guys are tuning in, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We would love to get them answered for you. So we are talking today about modern threats. What are some of the modern threats that are top of mind for utilities these days? Dominic?
So cybersecurity is already there, but we're going to cover that in a little bit. The threats are manifold to utilities, in my mind. But many of the threats for me, and as I'm talking to many utilities on the West Coast, across North America and globally, is the opportunities of change, right? Their customer base is becoming much more empowered. Generational options are there and multiple fold. Energy storage and generation combined. So having a conversation about, do we need more generational power, or do we need to store and co-locate or locate power more equitably across the grid? Those are the types of threats that come top of mind. But again, there is always the physical threats, the security and cyber threats that are there and are top of mind for me as well.
Great, thank you so much. John?
So yeah, I would definitely agree, and I think the categories of threats are similar to what they have been, although they seem to be growing in intensity. Cyber way up on the list, natural disasters, man-made disasters, disruption, so on. Here in Texas in February, we were debating what to call. Some folks were calling it snowvid. We had a historic winter storm in the middle of a pandemic, and also saw an increase in cybersecurity attacks during that time, because folks around the world realized, of course, that Texas is under a lot of stress at that time. So I think the types of threats that we've been dealing with are the same categories, increasing potentially in intensity. They're also increasing in integration in terms of having multiple hazards, multiple threats that you're having to deal with at any given time. And I think that enhances the strategic importance of resilience. We need to be able to handle multiple crises at one time and to adapt in a way that, as we were talking in the first question, is almost more organic, more like a living thing than a big machine. And I think that's those types of threats, I think, are converging, if you will, more so than they have been in the past.
Thank you. Shuli?
So I would definitely echo what the two of them said, but I'm going to add two more things. So not in any way diminishing any of the things they said. I completely agree. So, at the heart of the paradigm of our power system networks is inertia. It's the ability to actually balance supply and demand. And because of how we are building out the future power system networks, we're going to have to come up with ways of mimicking inertia or synthetic inertia. And some of those are going to happen through, grid forming inverters or things like that. But I think that there are other, arrows in our quiver or whatever that we can really be considering in terms of being able to enable the integration of renewables by being able to balance supply and demand. One of our projects that we just launched is called Shapeshifter, and it's all about how do you actually continue to balance the supply and demand and manage new things like congestion. Congestion is a real thing that happens in the internet, it happens in telecommunications networks, but it's not necessarily something that we've been seeing in power system networks, but that is evolving. And then the second thing is also related to inertia, which is about the human dynamics. And how do we actually build resilient organizations, resilient utilities, resilient network operators that actually have the capacity to move at the speed of both the technology and the urgency that face us. And that hasn't historically been true. At the heart of the organizational structure of utilities, and it's kind of like deep bows and gratitude for all of that has been done to keep our electricity on. But at the heart of it really has been stability and not changing. And now we have to actually do something completely different, which is manage gross instability and change at the speed of the technology and the innovations that we have opportunities to implement. And that's just a really different headset. And so I really think about the human dynamics and the human dynamics between technology innovation, regulators, and power system networks is broken. It's just a logjam. We have to find other ways to do rate cases that are going to allow us to change at the speed of the urgency that face us.
Thank you, Shuli. Some really interesting points there. And while you weren't necessarily counterpointing, Dominic or John, do you guys have anything to add or build on top of what Shuli said?
No, so I would like to build it because I didn't cover all my bases because we obviously had a prep. So we talked about, I didn't want to take some thunder from people. So I completely agree. So I think policy and governance within the industry needs to have a step change, evolve radically. As a IT provider to that community, I see a rampant need for evolution within our policies and how utilities are enabled to help themselves. I think there's a inertia in that space. Natural disasters are front and center. I think this evolving grid concept with the natural disasters of many different flavors across the globe that are coming into play need to be handled in combination with that renewable energy and making use of the technology provided much more rapidly is the challenge, the opportunity, and also top of mind, it's one of the threats, right? If we don't do it right, we're in trouble. And for me, passionately, it's about how you allow the customer to be part of that journey, right? Can those that afford to invest in PV and provide their own generation, those that can afford storage, those that can afford to turn off their power through the demand peaks and such, we need to empower and do that systematically and easily within the utility system. Technology providers such as SAP and others can do that today. It's a challenge to get that into the utilities and to change the thinking of the community within the utility that change is possible and right.
Great, thank you so much, Dominic. John?
Yeah, so I would agree, and I think, I would extend what they were saying even to tie it back to this concept of resilience, to say, I mean, I started my career in high-tech startups, and when I began, I thought a company that was stable for 18 months was pretty rock solid. When I moved into energy, kudos, I'm in awe that you can have an industry that is roughly stable for 100 years, where the basic technology is sound. I mean, that's absolutely amazing, wonderful design. I will also say that, without hopefully seeming like too much of an outsider, that the forces that are causing change and adaptability and demanding adaptability in other industries like retail, like media, like music distribution, are here for us in energy now. The time that we get to continue turning the same inertial crank, whether it's in our culture or in our technology, and doing the same thing for the next 30 years is just over. This is a high change industry now, and I think we need to adapt and adopt that, both from a technology and an operations standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint as well. So this, there's many conferences, and I think this is a good starting point where people talk about the pace of change, the pace of threats, the number of things that are happening, but there's not as many that do what we're doing here, which is to actually come to terms with that, to say, and what do you do? How do you adapt? How do you make sense of it? And how do you continue to thrive and deliver on your mission, despite the fact that the world is changing around you all the time? Like I said, I admire and I'm in awe of the stability of the electric industry, but I can tell you there's nothing special that's going to protect this industry for another 100 years to get to keep doing it the way it's done for the last 100.
Yeah, no, I mean, you guys have made some really fantastic points. In fact, we've got several audience questions coming through. And so we'll try to get those addressed. The first one is, will real-time data will data be able to update its status and run in the network, or will it depend on the current internet? So I guess there are going to have to be changes or upgrades to the internet in order to support the grid of the future utilizing real-time data.
I would love to take.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No.
Well, I'll give a quick thought and then hand it to Shuli. I think that I don't think the architecture of the internet needs to change in a very substantial way to meet our needs. I think that the scale and the amount of it needs to change. So a lot more bandwidth, a lot more stuff connected from, a lot more A to B points in that connection place. I think that the technologies for, kind of structurally and architecturally are there. I think we just have to figure out how to apply them and how to apply them in a secure way to our, to our industry. And so I think if you measured will the internet suffice? No, not if you mean in the sense of, are the amount of bits that are moving in 10 years going to be roughly equal to the capacity today? No, the capacity is grossly undersized, but the basic tools and architecture, I think, are right. We just have to kind of build it out, in my opinion. Shuli, I'll hand it to you too.
Yeah, I would build on that. So, I think that there's an opportunity with 5G to really evolve how we use the spectrum, how we move bits and bytes around. Again, none of us believe we're going to literally be networking electrons. What we're doing is networking the data about electrons. And I think, where we see the innovation beginning to emerge is being able to really clarify that there's a data-centric architecture and there's an event-centric architecture. Both of those things require enormous amounts of data. With event-centric, it's not that we are literally replacing old SCADA systems, but we are increasing the amount of event-centric data that will allow network operators to be able to orchestrate or choreograph the supply and demand to keep that synthetic inertia. So, we're about to do a 5G blueprint. We see this as absolutely the beginning. There's very little that's out there. Ericsson worked on one of our projects with Aachen University and Fraunhofer called Swanyo. And so we know that there's interest there, but in part, there is a whole conversation that needs to happen with the mobile carriers about critical infrastructure and how that's going to be treated. And I think we're at the beginning of that. And I think there's tremendous opportunity also with cloud and distributed computing to be able to support that. And so again, areas of innovation, companies that haven't even really looked at the energy space who need to be looking at the energy space, because that's where those innovations are going to come from. And they need to happen together in real time, and growing. And again, back to the regulatory problem, we have regulators who are not actually recognizing that's the direction we need to be going in. And so, the telecommunications and electricity or utilities have been typically convened in separate governance bodies, but there is going to be a place where they're going to intersect, and we need to start having rate cases that support that so that, in the United States, people understand that is the direction we're going.
Dominic.
So my comment to that is I completely agree with both John and Shuli. Bandwidth is going to be an issue, and the more data is helpful, right? But we need to recognize that more data isn't just going to come from the SCADA systems internally. We need to accept external data sources. The customer equipment is going to become very important to understanding the needs and where the power is needed, and to make decisions, actions from that data. So as a data person, I love data, but we need to make sure that we can get meaningful, actionable data from that data lake or that data ocean. My other point of view here is that utilities are in a unique situation that those data lakes shouldn't be siloed between themselves. They need to be shared. We need to get shared learning and collaboration between utilities much more at the forefront, with or without regulation, right? So policy sometimes mandates that we can't do some of these things, but we need to push back on that and say, we need as a nation to pull together better and understand our power requirements and understand the data modeling, so that one utility doesn't bear the brunt of its cost to do that, and then the other one does the same, and then the other one, and we're all paying as consumers for the utilities having to do their own modeling. We should have a cohesive understanding of what that industry model should be, and then communicate and share that.
Great, thank you. Oh, John, did you have something to add?
If I could add to that, I think what Dominic just mentioned about sharing data between utilities, I think is very important. When we share data between utilities now, we typically do it offline in situations like this, which is wonderful. It's usually humans sharing reports or sharing their knowledge. It's rare that utilities have direct access to raw real-time data between utilities. And I think as scary as that concept sounds, and with a caveat that I will follow all lawful regulations and understand that the regulatory framework needs to catch up with us. But I think that, you know, there are utilities that are trying to solve problems on our own. LCRA, New York Power Authority, Southern Company, and a lot of us have AI agents running on our cybersecurity data to detect anomalous patterns. We need to be able to do that on a shared data set to collectively defend against each other. I have pieces of the puzzle. NYPA has pieces of the puzzle. I can't only analyze my own data and solve my problem. And I think that happens, and as we were preparing, Shuli and others are great examples of, there's so many other examples in operational contexts and so on, where as utilities, the boundaries of data sharing and the way we share data really need to change to allow more data to flow across our organizational boundaries. Now, I realize from a security and a regulatory standpoint, that is not a simple thing to do. There are principles we have to enshrine in that to make sure competition and you know, regulation and sharing of information happens in the right way. But I think if we're not sharing data in real time, if we think on cyber that a information sharing consortium that warns you 3 days after the industry is fighting off an attack is good enough, it's not. Our metric for my cyber team is, you know, you need to get things patched before an information sharing consortium warns us about it, because that's way too late. That's not an effective way of sharing information. We've got to find a faster, more real-time way. The bad guys are doing it. And if we don't figure out a good way to do it as the good guys, we're going to fall behind.
Really great points. Thank you, everyone. So kind of expanding on what Dr. Goodman had stated, as we look at the EV footprint and expand that, will we be depending on software to balance charging dynamics for fleets? And how do utilities work with these fleets to help manage the load on the grid during peak times? Julie, you want to take that one first?
Yes. I mean, yes, and it gets back to what John is saying, because about do we go this alone, or do we actually come up with frameworks for data exchange? Because the truth is that, you know, there's going to be data centers, there's going to be charging infrastructure, there's going to be commercial and industrial, there's going to be aggregators with communities. There are going to be many different models, and we have to recognize all of those things are going to become important parts of how a network operator balances stuff. And so, you know, EVs are a load, but they also provide a resource if we kind of network these things appropriately. And, you know, I mean, I have a preference towards open source, and so like what John is just saying about different actors working together, we cannot get the data that we need around transmission towers. We can't do it around substations. We can't do it around, you know, anomalies. Like, all of those things require a collective effort, and being able to actually work like more industries work, which is, you know, the example I give is that we had the wheel. It put a lot of people out of business, but then that created roads, and roads created then global trade with the Silk Road. Open source is a tool that basically replaces some of the old infrastructure, and then gives us the ability to lay down new roads and new opportunities so that we can scale faster. And, you know, electric mobility, because it's kind of a greenfield, really gives us that opportunity to do this together, so that in the next 10 years, we can reduce 50% of our emissions from the power grid. And that will create coattails.
Good points. Dominic.
Yeah, just to build on top of some of those topics from Shuli, my background is implementing ERP software for safety first industries, asset intensive, one of those being aviation, airlines, which is a very competitive market. Because they're safety first, though, they have sharing models for their data, so that competitive airlines feed back failure, reliability data, issues found, so that it's shared across the industry, so that everyone is safe. That doesn't happen in utilities as much as I'm expecting or wanting from my experience. And I see that as a big need as utilities truly go into a safety first mode through the natural disasters, the other challenges that they're facing. Safety is becoming, it's always been top of mind, it's now really very high up there with everything else that they have to deal with. And part of that is sharing the burden across the community. Sorry, my computer's just talking to me. The other part of the equation here, or the question, was the EV chargers. And my mind is this really plays into the demand response management situation and helping utilities make the transition from traditional power, not 100% at the moment, but moving from their traditional power generation sources to a more even model, and then hopefully completely carbon free in a timeline that they can achieve. That timeline is going to be obviously a difficult thing for utilities to lock down and achieve, right? But one of the powerful tools that they have is demand response and connection to that customer, and connection to their other equipment, their high energy consumption equipment. And we need to start to build a model on how utilities can do that and policies to allow them to do that freely. In my opinion. So that's just and that includes the EV chargers, right? They're going to be huge power consumption usage points, and maybe we need to control those more readily and part of the grid.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, so I would key off of a word Shuli used of open. I think that when you think about, and I'll come right back to this in a second, is when you think about what an exciting time we're living in with electric vehicles, power walls, Nest thermostats, rooftop solar. I mean, we're sitting here in the energy industry. In the old days, we had to do it all ourselves. Now we have consumers that are so excited about the field of energy that they are literally buying infrastructure for themselves with their own money and installing it. And I think that's absolutely amazing. It is also unsettling for utilities because it is forcing us into an open world. We used to be more like the old days. If you're old enough to remember the early PC wars, we used to be like Apple PCs. We controlled the whole environment. And the world's starting to become more open. It's becoming, we can't be the only company that writes software. An open world around energy, a democratization of the energy grid is wonderful. It's actually really good. It's only frightening because it's disorganized. Democracy is messy. The solution to that is not to stop the change. It's not to ban the change. It's not to push all of those open devices out of our network. The solution is to figure out how to thrive in an open world. And the answer is ultimately software. It's going to be software and analytics that helps us to manage that grid and manage that complexity in a more dynamic way. If we can handle the fact that, yes, this is wonderful that consumers are going to buy EVs and they're not going to plug them in the same exact pattern today in the city as they did yesterday. If they're going to buy power walls, but they're not going to use them exactly the same way. So we don't need to block these things. We need to try to figure out how we can build a grid that adapts and is smarter and can handle these things coming into its open system and be able to support them and take advantage of the fact that, if customers and consumers want to spend some of their own money to create generating infrastructure or storage infrastructure, we should love that. We should incentivize that and want to make it happen as much as possible, not fear it and try to stop it.
All really fantastic points. Thank you, everyone. A lot of this open source and distributed assets and management of assets and a bunch of other things can add to the complexity, right? Or will add to the complexity of managing the grid as we know it, or what it will ultimately be. The last audience question that we have so far is, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, which is a quote from Leonardo da Vinci. Does growing the complexity of the grid represent a threat from within? It becomes so complex that it becomes unwieldy.
With respect to the questioner, sorry, go ahead. With respect to the questioner and Leonardo da Vinci, I think simplicity is great, but the question is simplicity for who? I think it should be simple for the consumer. I don't think it matters if it's complicated for us. We're smart and we can work hard. So I think it should be simple for the consumer. They should feel in the future that they can buy these types of devices, they can change their needs and loads, that threats can come to the grid, and it just sort of seems to somehow just work. It should be simple for them. I don't care if it's complicated and hard for us. That's our job to figure that out, and it may be complicated and hard for us inside, but that's just our job, I think. Shuli, sir, go ahead.
No, I think that's really important. I mean, from a design pattern perspective, you know, the internet is extremely complex. Telecommunications networks are extremely complex. And we figure out how to abstract that complexity with software. And I don't think, you know, at an evolutionary level, things do not evolve, and then, you know, either they are affected by entropy and they collapse, or they actually have step changes and they evolve. And so, you know, I'm looking at not that the complexity kills us, but that we evolve our systems in order to manage that complexity. And that is a really great challenge. And in my mind, it is a really great thing for young people who are probably looking at the world and going, oh my God, like, how are we going to do this? And in part, it's that this is your moonshot. This is your opportunity. This is your career path. Because what we're doing is abstracting the complexity using software. That's how I see it. And and there was one thing that you said about governance, John. I think you said it. You know, in part, the evolution of what we're having to do really rapidly is also evolve our governance structures in a way so that they can keep pace with change. And you know, what I love about the Linux Foundation and about the very lightweight kind of governance is that it enables joint investment. And it doesn't, you know, there were no guns fired, nobody died, and yet the Linux kernel became sort of the foundation of, you know, our information superhighway. And that's a really great example from an adoption and innovation perspective, because we go, oh, okay, that can happen. Cloud went from nothing to being ubiquitous in a very short period of time. Those things are good news for us humans, because it means we can change at the pace of the change. We can change at the pace of the urgency.
And Dominic, what do you have to add?
Not too much, other than I love John's answer. That was fantastic. But I'm of the mindset that simple isn't always the right choice. Sometimes we have to make the complicated and difficult choice. And history has taught me that what was once perceived or one once thought was complex, the whole point of technology and advancement is to make it simple. So life is getting more complicated, but we then make it simpler. So we're just in an inflection point that there's a lot more complexity coming to the industry, right? It's been, I won't say it's been easy for the last 100 years, but it's been what it has been for 100 years. Now utilities are front and center for some of the wrong reasons, some very important reasons, and we need to make difficult choices that might seem complicated today, but we here as the industry and around are there to make it simpler into the future. And that's part of the young person's input into this as well, not to bring the 100+ years worth of thought process and think differently.
Man, I feel like these audience questions have really sparked a lot. Sorry, John, I didn't mean to step over you.
Oh, no, that's, I didn't have anything else.
Oh, okay. Okay, to get back on track a little bit, because we're talking about modern threats, we've gone on to some really great tangents, but from a cybersecurity perspective, you guys have kind of touched on these things, but just very clearly and directly, you know, what can utilities do to increase security?
Staying current with their patch levels, using the latest software, embracing technology to help them, and it's never going to be good enough, right? It's not good enough now. It won't be good enough tomorrow, and it wasn't good enough yesterday. Accepting that fact of life, right, with cybersecurity, they're a dynamic group. Those people that want to do harm, they are smart, and they can use and adapt to the system far quicker than the utilities industry. And we need to recognize that and maybe do some changes around that.
John or Shuli?
So yeah, I'll add to that. I think when I started at LCRA, like I said, about 8 years ago, I initially didn't think cybersecurity was going to be too hard because we're a wholesale energy and water provider. We don't do retail, so we don't have a lot of personally identifiable customer information. So at first I was like, this is going to be great. And I literally woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, bolt up right after I decided to take the job, and remembered that we have to protect critical infrastructure. And that means that there's not a lot of ways you can make money by disrupting us, but there are, there are some, but there are a small number of threat actors that utilities have to worry about that are nation states or their proxies. And this is a smaller number of kind of potential hackers that we have to worry about versus if we were like, a healthcare company. But the downside is the hackers and the adversaries we're working against are much more sophisticated, smaller in numbers, but really, really good. There is no utility on Earth, there is no software company on Earth that can defeat these types of attackers on their own. We need to do all the good things NIST says, patching, all that kind of stuff. The biggest thing we need to do is work together. We need to work together with our partner utilities. We need to work together with software companies. We need to work together with state governments, regulators, national governments, Department of Defense, NSA. This has to be, we have an advantage as the good guys and gals on this side versus those that are trying to disrupt us. The good team can work together. We can work together openly in the daylight. We don't operate in the shadows. We need to start working much more closely together, sharing information. I've started hearing this term collective defense in the industry. I think that's a great approach. You can call it cyber mutual aid, you can call it collective defense, but we have to start to work together as utilities against this threat. If we band together to say, I'm not worried about somebody else finding out that I had a breach. What I'm worried about is responding to the breach and recovering, and ideally keeping it from happening in the first place. So to me, it's really that teamwork of getting us to kind of lock arms around sharing data. And ultimately, my dream and my hope is that someday, and we've had some great collaboration with utilities in the Central Texas region on this, is someday I think we should be as good at cyber mutual aid as we are at physical mutual aid around bucket trucks and transmission lines, because they're all coming for all of us, and we might as well work together to solve it.
Thank you. And Shuli?
Well, I love what John just said. And I mean, I think that one of the things from a paradigm shift is that, if you talk to people and they talk about the grid, they talk about the largest machine on the planet. But we are in transition to become kind of a very organic kind of global brain, of which energy and power are part of the aspects of that. And, just like if you're a human being, you can take a pill to support your immune system, but actually it's your everyday life and the things that you do, and the processes by which, you eat, you exercise, the ways that you take care of yourself. And I think that that's also true. It gets back to the human dynamic about organizations, which is that security is actually a process that lives throughout the entire software lifecycle. And I know that there are, physical cybersecurity issues, but just, or physical security issues, but just from a kind of digital perspective, there's a life cycle. It begins with design and it goes all the way to retirement. And so when you build an organization that actually embeds the process of security, it needs to start at the very beginning and go all the way through. That's what I would like to see. And I completely echo that this is something that has to be done in community. So very exciting that we can actually do this well.
Thank you all so much. We have time for about one, maybe two more questions. And, cybersecurity threats are not the only threats that are facing the grid right now. Climate change, extreme weather, and emergency situations are on the rise. How are utilities managing these threats? And is there more that could be done? Dominic?
There's always more that can be done, right? So that's a setup question and a half. But what they're doing today, many utilities are embracing the AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Obviously, drones and eyes on. Is there more? Yes. I personally feel the demand response area is something that needs to be embraced more regularly, more broadly, and with more tools, more options for customers to sign over their equipment. If in a high peak usage period, I'm willing to shut down everything except for my refrigerator, and I've got the ability to do that. Utility, take it from me. Things like that, just thinking a little differently and embracing the customer's impact. Because in talking to many utilities, the industrial and commercial sector has already done huge amounts to try and meet the demand response, and the consumer, the retail user, you and I, have in our numbers, in our mass, a huge impact that we can bring to the grid. And I think this is important in the radical change from CO2 heavy pollutants in power generation to PV and solar and wind and renewables in helping utilities achieve their goals in sustainability in that regard. So that, I'm conscious of time, I'll shut up there and pass it on to Shuli.
I think another way of looking at it, which I think builds on what you're saying, is so network operators traditionally kind of look at a bottom-down view, that they're just going to flood the market with electrons. I think that there's a whole other view with regards to resilience. It definitely builds on demand response, but it's the transition from analog electrons to digital electrons, meaning that we have plugs in this country and all over the world where we just plug the plug in and we have vampire loads. And there is no data that is actually passed from that load to any kind of controlling infrastructure within the house. I see this evolution not only of the top-down view, but I see this transformation from a bottom-up view, whether it's light switches or industrial equipment or dryers, washers, appliances, water systems. All of those things, once they become digital, can actually be networked together in support of the power system network. And that really requires industrial transformation. So from now, for the next 8 years, I think that there is a tremendous effort that has to be bottom down and developing that software that signals for demand response. But when we start getting to the 60%, 70%, 80% decarbonization, the farther out we go, the more radical we're going to have to be in managing our electrons from a demand perspective and creating new ways of networking things in resilience to that power system network.
Great, thank you. And John?
Yeah, so your question is spot on. I think that the number, the type of threats that we're dealing with that have the potential, man-made and not, that have the potential to disrupt the providing of the critical services that we're accountable for as energy providers, is just multiplying. The severity is increasing, the integration between them is increasing. We've talked about a lot of the things in this panel that you can do about that. We've talked about technology a lot, and I think I love technology. I think technology is a significant part of that solution. But to me, if the answer to that is resilience, to me, the way you do that is fundamentally about people. One of the amazing things, and I love the biologically inspired examples Shuli used earlier, one of the amazing things about people, about the human being that separates us from pretty much everything else on Earth, is we can think, we can reason, we can take in data and we can make sense of it. We can determine that something is a threat or not a threat. We can work together to find solutions. And I think our ability to make sense of our environment, to think and to adapt, is going to be the way that we handle this. And I think that we're good at doing that as individuals. We're not great as an industry at doing that together. I think we need to build companies and partnerships across companies where we are thinking together, where we're leveraging that ability to take in this new, sometimes scary information about how the world around us is changing, to make sense of it, and to come up with solutions. That's what we do. That is probably this distinguishing characteristic of the human being. It is part of the cause of some of the problems that we're dealing with, but it's also the solution in my book. And I think if we can do it more and do it together, we'll find our way out of all this.
Amazing. Well, thank you. Oh, sorry, Shuli, go ahead.
I just wanted to add one thing, which is in that way, it is an epic battle between consciousness and catastrophe. And
that's right.
And it's really important that even though we are a largely left brain industry that thinks in math and physics, we actually have to start thinking about consciousness because we are transforming consciousness, both the grid, the things that use the grid, all of those things. And that is what's going to save us from catastrophe. So complete build on what you're saying. Totally love it.
I mean, I think this panel has been really just a knockout panel. I'm hoping that in the future we can get the three of you onto another one because we have a handful of questions we didn't get to. And so that just means that there's an excuse for us to get together again. Thank you so much. Up next, we have a prologue to building resilient connections with Kelly Tomlin and Jason Rodriguez. With that, I hope you all stick around and enjoy the rest of our ETS 2021.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.